Hello, I'm Caitlin Elise Cockler. This is my submission for interpreting Romans. In Romans 6:16, Paul writes, "Do you not know that if you present yourselves to anyone as obedient slaves, you are slaves of the one whom you obey, either of sin, which leads to death, or of obedience, which leads to righteousness? The thing that most defines our actions is the order of our loves. We serve what we love first, whether we know it or not, making that thing our God." Slavery in the first century Greco-Roman world was different from slavery in the rest of the world because it wasn't based on race. An article published by PBS describes it the majority of slaves in Rome at that time as foreigners, prisoners of war, sailors captured and sold by pirates, or slaves brought outside of Roman territory. As a slave, you were property of your owner. You were branded, brutally mistreated, misplaced, whipped, etc. Another difference in Roman slavery was manumission, or the ability that sometimes owners would set their slaves free. Slaves were driven by this idea of manumission because it made them work all the harder in hopes of not being captive anymore. In the Jefferson reading, we see that Rome unfortunately became dependent on slaves for most of its work, including agricultural. This relates to Romans 6:15-23, because just as the foreigners and prisoners in the Greco-Roman world were slaves to their masters, we have the potential to be slaves to our sin and wickedness. If the order of our loves is skewed and selfish, then not only are we putting limitations on ourselves, we are actually enslaving ourselves to sin and death. Just like the slaves in Rome were driven by this idea of manumission or potential freedom, we can be driven by the same thing that our master, whether it's an addiction, the love of a significant other, status, thrill, pride, accomplishment, any of those things, we're driven by it, but it will not be our freedom. The only difference between us and the slaves in Rome is that sometimes they were set free from their masters, but if our master is anything other than the sacrificial love of Jesus and the insane and impossible, incomprehensible grace provided by his love, then we will never be set free. Douglas J. Moo writes that when we are slaves to goodness and righteousness, we are slaves to God. We are set free from the limitations of our natural selves and our flesh, and everyone has this order of loves in their lives, and if we put our Savior at the top, we will be set free.